Thank you, Danielle, for that generous introduction. I'd like to live up to it. I've amassed so many regrets over my career. It really helps to hear such nice things being said about me. So I really appreciate you reciting everything I asked you to say today. I also want to thank you for inviting me to be the keynote speaker at this important conference. It's quite an honor to be asked in light of how much I respect the quality of work and leadership of various luminaries in this field, including some folks who are here today. Moreover, I've devoted much of my career to the theme of this conference. So in addition to, I'm having trouble reading this down here. So in addition to being delighted to be its keynoter, I want to thank you for conceiving of this conference and bringing it to fruition. Having organized some conferences like this myself, I know how much work goes into the planning and execution. And I'm glad that you already got a good round of applause for accomplishing this. Another reason I'm glad to be giving this keynote address is that when I listen to others giving long talks, I have trouble staying awake. And that can get me in trouble, especially when I wait for a night and they're cussing at me. And that really happened once at a faculty meeting. In the role of speaker, however, I hope to avoid falling asleep. Before I begin, let me warn you that I like to be provocative in my writing, in my speaking, and consequently, I'll probably say some things with which some of you will disagree. Whenever I do, however, at least I hope you'll appreciate their value in stimulating dialogue. I'll also cite Yogi Berra a couple of times, and I hope that you'll find my provocative comments to be less bizarre than some of his, as you can see. The history of efforts to bridge the gap between research and practice shows that the theme of this conference addresses a long-standing challenge in social work and other professions. Even though Mary Richmond called for social work practice to be guided by research a century ago, social work practitioners by and large have devalued research studies and rarely utilize them to guide their practice. This problem has persisted despite two national conferences during the late 1970s and another in the early 1990s, like this one, which, like this one, attempted to bridge the gap between research and practice. The gap has outlived the empirical clinical practice movement, which in its heyday spawned so much optimism about bridging the gap. And the gap continues to persist today, despite the progress made in the evidence-based practice movement. The gap also has outlived several other developments. I'm not going to read them, I'll just let you see them up there. The gap continues today as university administrators pressure deans of schools of social work to bring in more research funding. Indeed, we hear a lot these days about obtaining major research funding as a prerequisite for garnering tenure and promotion among social work faculty. In one sense, this pressure may be helping to narrow the gap between research and practice in social work. As well-funded social work researchers have helped provide the empirical support for various empirically supported treatments, they have shown practitioners more effective ways to intervene, and thus paving the way for more practitioners to be guided by research. And yet, despite the great strides that have been made in the development of empirically supported treatments, which I'm going to refer to as ESTs. Those of you that aren't real familiar with that acronym, you might want to make a little note. Whenever I say EST, I'm talking about empirically supported treatments. In light of those strides, a variety of studies have found that the degree to which these ESTs are being implemented appropriately and with successful outcomes in the real-world practice of social workers and their colleagues in allied professions has been terribly disappointing. In response to this disappointment, a rich field of implementation science has blossomed, which is beginning to identify factors at various organizational levels that help to explain why some organizations have been more successful than others in implementing ESTs with adequate fidelity and good outcomes. By identifying these factors, implementation science can offer recommendations for bridging the gap between research and practice, at least with respect to implementing ESTs with fidelity. Some of these promising recommendations will be presented by speakers at this conference. Despite the value of these recommendations, however, their successful implementation will have to overcome some negative attitudes about research among not only rank and file practitioners and administrators, but also among some of our professionals, our profession's esteemed leaders. For example, in 1998, as president of SWIR, I attended a national NASW Summit meeting that was held with the purpose of uniting the diverse elements of the social work profession and identifying what issues and priorities social work organizations could agree upon. And yet, despite that unification purpose, the summit's keynote speaker decried the excessive amount and excessive influence of research in social work education. He added that he is insulted by the notion that we need to research the outcome of our efforts to provide care. Hearing that, I left that summit less than sanguine about the prospects of ever bridging the gap between research and practice. However, that summit meeting was 15 years ago. Let's hope that much has changed since then, especially in light of the growth of the evidence-based practice movement. One promising change is the current effort to begin to identify common elements that are shared by various ESTs. The aim of identifying those common elements is to make the implementation of ESTs more acceptable, less complex, and less costly to practitioners and agencies. Instead of expecting practitioners to rigidly adhere to an entire manualized EST, identifying the core, essential, and indispensable elements of the EST, as well as its adaptable elements, might give practitioners more flexibility to make the EST fit their organization and clientele, and also reduce the costs of practitioner training. However, there's a big difference between adapting a specific EST for a specific setting or population and trying to identify a broad array of common elements shared by various ESTs. Taking the broader approach to identifying common elements can be risky. For example, consider the difference between the common elements identified by Chirpida and those identified by Bender and Bright. Chirpida and associates searched for common elements in the ESTs for depression in girls between ages 10 to 12. Their search yielded those 23 common elements in order of the relative frequency with which each appeared in the RCT literature for that target population. By RCT literature, RCT refers to randomized clinical trials. I'll just let you take a look at those. What I really want to emphasize is that in contrast to the approach taken by Chapita et al., which limited their search to depressed girls between ages 10 and 12, Bender and Wright reviewed RCTs for a target population specified in much broader terms. Quote, disruptive behavior and traumatic stress among adolescent girls. After reviewing a database of 430 RCTs of mental health interventions for youth, again notice the broadness of their search boundaries, they recommended that instead of training practitioners in any particular manualized EST for disrupting behavior and traumatic stress among adolescent girls, they instead be trained in the 8 common elements shown on this slide. Now, keeping in mind that the population targeted by Bender and Wright included traumatic stress, do any of you notice any important omission in the list? Okay, good. I'll say it myself. Notice in the 8 common elements derived by Bender and Wright that there was no mention of exposure therapy, which is known to be the most empirically supported treatment for traumatic stress. Notice also the absence of cognitive processing therapy from their list, which also has a strong evidence base in trauma treatment, especially when coupled with exposure therapy. Therefore, I recommend caution when employing the common elements approach, especially if the common elements are derived from casting a very wide net to find a very broad and diverse database of interventions for a diverse range of target populations. We need to be careful not to derive the common elements from too wide a net. The striking difference between the list of 8 common elements derived by Bender and Wright and the 23 derived by Chapita et al. Speaks both to the promise of the common elements approach as well as to some of its risk. In that connection, I've developed this continuum for the purposes of this talk today. Several distinctions are important to note here. One is that common elements approaches can be characterized as following somewhere within a continuum from very narrow to very broad. At the narrowest end of the continuum on the left, the approach can be limited to a single EST, and in this case, the common elements are those that are the core parts of the intervention that need to be kept, but that can be adapted to fit different targets or different populations. A less narrow approach, moving one place to the right, might involve identifying common elements across a small set of ESTs that target the same problem. A broader approach would identify common elements that target different problems, but would not cast too wide of a net regarding the range of problems being targeted. At the broadest end of the continuum would be approaches like the one taken by Bender and Wright, in which a very wide net is cast to identify common elements across a diverse range of ESTs and a diverse range of target problems. I suggest that the riskiness of the common elements approach increases as we move from the narrower to the broader end of the continuum. In fact, while extolling the promise of the common elements approach, Barth et al., Rick Barth, cautioned that although, quote, although the common elements approach allows for flexibility, following the treatment manual as the prescribed way may still be the best option when appropriate or available. Now, despite the progress being made in implementation science, there is evidence that when ESTs are implemented with excellent fidelity in real-world agencies, they only modestly outperform treatment as usual. And when considering possible reasons for the disappointing degree to which ESTs are being implemented successfully in the real world of practice, we may need to consider some of the problems in the research supporting the ESTs, especially the degree to which RCTs are assessing ESTs that have limited transferability to real-world practice conditions.